Welcome. I'm Johnny Zanalda, the director of the Rethinking Diplomacy Program and co-director of the Space Diplomacy Lab. And I would like to welcome our panelists today, Dr. Claire Fiesler and Dr. Alex Scull, and my colleagues from the Rethinking Diplomacy team, Ambassador Bob Pearson and Dr. Ben Schmidt. I'm glad that to have this panel today is the first event of the Space Diplomacy webinar series of this academic year. And so we are thrilled that we are not going to talk only about space, but also about ocean. And this is part of the interesting aspect of the series that we put space diplomacy in conversation with other type of diplomacies. Having said that, I'm also glad to say that Dr. Fiesler is an alumna from Duke University, and so welcome back. And thank you to Dr. Carl to join us from Hawaii. It's pretty early in the morning there, so thank you to join us for so early in the morning. Dr. Schmidt, my colleague, Dr. Schmidt will introduce the speakers and the event. We will have, after initial remarks by the two panelists, we will have a conversation with the other panelists and with the audience. So feel free to submit your questions or comments to the Q&A function throughout the event. We will raise your questions with the panel, and so it's really an informal conversation, and let's take advantage of having such distinguished guests. Thank you, Ben.
Well, thank you, Giovanni, and thank you everyone for attending today. Today is the first meeting of the Space Diplomacy Lab webinar series for the fall 2022 semester. And we thought we'd kick things off for all of the sky-high diplomacy that's been going on in terms of the Space Diplomacy Lab by looking in the other direction. Although we'll keep looking up, there's a lot of lessons that space diplomacy can learn from ocean diplomacy. For centuries, human maritime activity has driven cultural, social, and economic contexts and exchanges between various regions of the planet, driving the development of diplomatic exchanges and cooperation between peoples the world over. This indispensable role of the oceans has continued to drive diplomatic engagement over the past century as landmark multilateral accords, such as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is something we've brought up in this series as an analog to the Outer Space Treaty, and science-based ocean diplomacy have aided the development of international agreements with impacts on methods of cooperation across many other areas of contemporary diplomacy. One area that can benefit from these lessons learned, and this is why we're having this today, is building on the decades of evidence-based ocean diplomacy by bringing that into the space diplomacy domain that we've been studying through this program. The increasing focus by diplomats on the interplay between space science, the space domain, and the terrestrial economic, security, and geopolitical issues that we are seeing on a weekly basis today should include an exploration of how the diplomatic community can benefit from other areas of diplomacy. Our framework, of course, is based on the safe and sustainable use of outer space and an anticipatory diplomacy approach. And that's something that the ocean diplomacy community certainly has been building out for years. So this is really what we're thrilled to talk about today. And we're joined by Dr. Claire Fiesler and Dr. Alex Scull. And we'll have opening statements from each. So first I'll introduce Dr. Fiesler. Dr. Fiesler is the Justice Sandra Day O'Connor Fellow at the Smithsonian Institution. Her research synthesizes new and existing data to design monitoring strategies for understudied marine mammal populations, including those exposed to past and future climate extremes. As part of her fellowship, Claire also studies how knowledge sharing and diplomacy affect transboundary dialogue on marine conservation. Her previous research focused on conservation evidence, management, and monitoring for climate-stressed coral reef ecosystems. Claire is a photojournalist, science writer, former AAAS mass media fellow, and has recently published an article for Slate magazine that I spoke with her about. I was honored to give an interview to contribute to on science diplomacy and the interplay between ocean and space diplomacy. She received her master's degree from Duke University, welcome back, and worked as Duke's Ocean Policy Fellow and received her PhD in ecology from UNC Chapel Hill, studying climate-threatened protected areas in the Caribbean. So to start, I'd like to just ask Claire, can you just give an opening set of remarks, and then we'll go to Dr. Cole.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ben. I'm so thrilled to be here. You know, I am an alum. I graduated of my master's from the School of the Environment in 2010, and then I worked for a year and a half at the Nicholas Institute at Duke, both down at Beaufort, then here in Washington. And I had the tremendous privilege to work with various professors at Duke. And then most importantly, I want to mention that the Duke Center for International and Global Studies fully funded my master's degree, which was fantastic. And so it's so great to be back here, very full circle. And you know, I'm going to give a very quick background of how I came to this topic of ocean diplomacy. Even though I didn't study diplomacy for my PhD, but I think it'll be worthwhile because anyone who's joining maybe is just broadly or vaguely interested in ocean diplomacy, and I can show how I kind of came to the topic in recent years. So I'm going to quickly share my screen. I'm not going to barrage you with slides, just a couple slides here.
Great, we can see the slides. Great.
Sorry about that. It's like 2 years into the pandemic, I still can't do Zoom. So everyone can see my slides. Great. So I do work at the National Museum of Natural History, which is one of many museums and research centers, part of the Smithsonian Institution. We are part of the U.S. federal government, and this is a picture of the waters off the coast of the Persian Gulf. And the Smithsonian has an MOU with both Qatar and the United Arab Emirates to help those countries conserve their cultural heritage as well as natural heritage that extends into the ocean. And that's kind of first how I came into this topic, because I've been working in Qatar on building a marine mammal monitoring network for the Persian Gulf. Currently, it doesn't exist. So when a dead marine mammal washes up on the beach, currently it's often just kind of buried or tossed in a dumpster. But other countries usually collect that data. We're trying to help Gulf states collect data as well. So this is a picture of a Indian Ocean humpback dolphin. This is a picture from May of this year, and we're trying to collect data and then engage citizen scientists in helping collect this data as well. But for a whole year, we couldn't go out in the field and do this type of work. And so it started getting us thinking about data sharing across countries. And we ran up against some real issues, diplomatic issues of sharing knowledge between countries, given the political situation in the Gulf. There was a political blockade between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and all these bordering countries. That was an issue in trying to share data about marine mammals in the Persian Gulf. And so as a way to try to start to wrestle with these issues of how to share data and engage scientists across the Gulf when often their countries don't talk to one another, the Smithsonian funded a 2-day virtual summit with experts from every country around the Gulf, including Iran and Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and other states. And we started thinking about this issue of ocean diplomacy more broadly. And so this is just a screenshot of all of us talking together. And so it went from sharing data about marine mammals and marine biodiversity to how do scientists fit into the larger apparatus of diplomacy. This is often called track 2 diplomacy, as I learned. Track 1 diplomacy being diplomat to diplomat, government to government. Track 2 being, the NGOs, companies, scientists in those countries. And then through my work and engaging other scholars on this topic, I've learned about track 1.5 diplomacy, which is basically a hybrid of the two. And it just So we put together this, you'll see these two screenshots here. The left is a letter that myself and 20 co-authors from around the Gulf co-authored in Science Magazine entitled Diplomacy for the World's Hottest Sea. And if you want a copy of this article, I think we're going to send it out afterwards to the center. Essentially, building a roadmap for how scientists may be able to engage across, with each other across the region, despite political tensions, and how, especially with these new treaties like the Convention on Biological Diversity, which many will be signing, many of the countries will be signing, they'll be setting up these marine protected areas in their waters. And scientists can already do the work now of laying the groundwork for those, citing those marine protected areas, coordinating, planning for transboundary marine protected areas. And there's a real precedent for this. There's a transboundary marine protected area between North Korea and South Korea. It's a marine peace park. And, if North Korea and South Korea can do it, well, then surely, Qatar and Saudi Arabia can as well, in theory. And so these conversations started happening amongst this group of scholars we put together and building a working group on this and publishing this paper. And it was great. And then I flew to the Netherlands this summer to meet with international relations scholars working on ocean governance and ocean diplomacy issues, and kind of try to anticipate what's going to be the next thing in ocean diplomacy, given that a lot of things are changing, but how we can listen to smaller countries, maybe countries in conflict, poorer countries, in what solutions they can bring to the table. And so, this science letter led me to write this other article in Slate about, the way that, ocean diplomacy gives me hope for science diplomacy in general. And the way I thought, the International Space Station was a relic of the past. And then I ended up calling up Ben and interviewing him for this article as well. But in short, one of the things that I learned from my colleagues in the Middle East is, an Iraqi colleague told me, like, the Middle East post-conflict, the Middle East may never be post-conflict. And the way that Middle Eastern countries have built that into how they engage across borders. And, maybe the International Space Station, when it was established and when the agreements were put in place, perhaps it wasn't as anticipatory as it could have been for conflict. And I think anticipatory diplomacy is something that countries who are, actors, state actors, non-state actors who are concerned with the ocean have been dealing with for a really long time. And so, in this article for Slate, I brought up a lot of examples, especially from poorer countries, regional examples of the ways, that ocean, diplomatic ocean solutions have anticipated for, conflict, especially like there are marine peace parks in Africa that, that are, transboundary in nature. I'm thinking of the one between South Africa and Mozambique that I discuss in my article, in which, the African peace parks model anticipates for conflict specifically, and that's a great model for devising solutions for ocean conservation. And then there's other examples as well, of how richer countries can engage smaller countries in collaborative research and really engaging with scientists. And ocean diplomacy has done a really good job of engaging scientists. And the great thing about scientists is that scientists build these relational connections that persist through varying political ups and downs. And it's often these relationships between the scientists themselves, or NGOs and scientists, that keep the conversation going, that keep the dialogue going. And that's what I found in the Middle East. And that's also what I found elsewhere in my examples from Africa. And a great example of that is I was actually in a phone call this week with USAID and some researchers, US researchers and Iraqi researchers. And there's been, I'll just mention this briefly, and I'll turn the mic over. There's been a lot of conservation efforts for the Iraqi marshlands. You might have heard about this. And that a lot of that stopped, millions and millions of dollars were invested in this big coastal conservation project by the United States government. And a lot of that stopped in 2017. And even though that effort paused, the scientists never stopped talking. And now they're picking up again now with a new administration that is interested in continuing this conservation, this development work. And I think that's a great example of the way that engaging science and bring these, track 2 diplomacy closer into these space diplomacy now, it can really help with the political ups and downs. But I'll stop there, and really interested to hear from Alex about where fisheries fits into all of this.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fiesler. And next we have Dr. Alex Call, who is a natural resources manager in the International Fisheries Division of the NOAA Fisheries Pacific Islands Regional Office. He helps implement the South Pacific Fisheries Treaty between certain Pacific Island countries and the United States, which includes vessel licensing and maintaining current documentation for U.S. Vessels tuna fishing across the Western and Central Pacific Oceans. He also works with the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission on international fisheries in the region. Alex received his PhD in oceanography at Rutgers University and a postdoc at the Palmer Research Station in Antarctica. Afterward, he received an American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS Fellowship in Science, Technology, and Policy, where he worked at among other locations, the Bureau of Energy Resources, sitting down the hall from me. And in 2017, he ended his tenure as a diplomat serving as a senior watch officer at the State Department, then joined the NOAA Fisheries team at the Pacific Islands Regional Office in Hawaii. And again, we are so grateful that although it is noon on the East Coast, it is much, much earlier in Hawaii. So thank you so much for calling in so early. So over to you, Alex.
Well, aloha. Thank you, Ben, and thank you for the invitation to participate, and as well getting to meet Claire and a number of the other organizers of the event. So thank you. I'm looking forward to the questions from the participants. And the sun is up just a little bit here in Hawaii, so a bit better than we were chatting earlier. I think you did give me, as you were providing those opening remarks, just a bit of background for those who, in the audience who are, looking to the future and wondering what the wide open world presents. And the fact that I would end up in the fishery space I'm in now was never on the radar. I think, Ben, as you noted, we were working on energy resources, really oil and gas, and I think for both of us, a very interesting space that was actually really good proving grounds for this diplomacy element of today's discussion. And so, as you mentioned, my background is really in the hard science. So building, actually, Claire's presentation provided a lot of opening for where I wasn't quite sure exactly where I was going to go, but my understanding, I'll be honest, I don't know a lot about the law of the sea, but I am very familiar with, the framework that it's presented the world for managing and, securing the ocean and its resources. And so that's kind of the direction I was hoping to take the group, just very briefly as an example. And I'm not quite sure what the fish may translate to in outer space. Maybe there's yummy space aliens up there we seek to take advantage of and need to manage. So if that happens, there'd be really direct application. But otherwise, I think really that the lesson is looking at these kind of where Claire was getting to. How do you conserve and in my case, focus on exploitation sustainably of a shared resource, and maybe where that ownership isn't entirely clear, or in the case of many fish species called the migratory species, they actually move from place to place. So they may exist in one country's waters, then another country's waters, and then nobody's waters, really the international waters. And this is, I think, a lot of the issues Claire is working on now is that, areas beyond national jurisdiction. And that is a hot topic very much in all aspects. of fisheries management. And so very specifically, the UN Fish Stocks Agreement was agreed and is being implemented under the law of the sea. So, and there's a portion of the law of the sea that focuses on straddling and highly migratory fish stocks. And so this UN Fish Stocks Agreement really seeks to dive into that. And within that Fish Stocks Agreement, there are both the straddling stocks and the highly migratory species. The straddling stocks are ones that may sit between two countries' EEZs or the high seas. The highly migratory species like tuna is the big moneymaker. They'll move hundreds and thousands of miles. And so, their ownership of these species is really collectively managed. There's no way for one member to assert ownership. So within the Fish Stocks Agreement, then very zeroing in on the migratory species, we have the United Nations, within that framework, entities have been established, each of them enjoining its members by a convention. So this is a treaty, a multilateral treaty that members sign on to. And these are called regional fisheries management organizations. And I know beforehand I said I wasn't going to throw anything up, but as Claire was talking, it became eminently clear that maps are going to be necessary for this discussion. All right. And so, sorry, I forgot to provide my normal disclaimer. Ben is familiar with this. So I remain an active federal employee. Part of the reason this early hour works well is I'm not actively engaged in my federal duties. So even though you see the NOAA Fisheries tag on the bottom, this is not being made on behalf of NOAA Fisheries. Everything I'm saying is very much in my personal capacity. So really this definition here is the collaborative international body focused on effectively managing marine resources such as tuna. Everybody can read that. What's more important here is just demonstrating how there's more than one RFMO for the Pacific Ocean. And then you can expand this globally. These RFMOs have overlapping areas of jurisdiction. And this is sort of this convention area is really the fundamental, fundamental elements, just defining what is it we're managing. And now space, right? Now you're talking 3 dimensions or planets. I don't know how you guys are going to do that. I can just perhaps give you a case study and the complexity of this I would offer relatively simple by comparison case study. So the WCPFC is the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, and that's bordered by that red line. The hatched line is the adjacent fisheries management organization. So that's for the Eastern Pacific, covering a lot of Latin American countries are members there. And then what you can see a big difference in this case, and this is a lot of the complexity of the world I operate in, is the fact that our RFMO, the WCPFC, and we use the acronym, the vast majority of that is actually, not the vast majority, but a large chunk of it, let's say half, is actually encumbered by the EEZs, the exclusive economic zones of its members. So you can see that's very different by comparison to the IATTC, which has a far more expanse of open ocean or areas beyond national jurisdiction. And again, that becomes more important, especially when one considers the work that Claire is doing on marine biodiversity. So this is kind of like this, it's a spaghetti Venn diagram of sorts. Really the point here is I've overlaid a number of fisheries management organizations in the Pacific. So you'll see kind of on the right side, I have WCPFC there in the blue. At the bottom left, I have the IATTC, and there's a color corresponding box. But the point here being, these are all members, and the complexity of trying to engage different members with different rule sets bound by each of these organizations. What you will see is the United States very much finds itself at the middle of all these overlapping bodies with jurisdictional authority of fisheries management or fisheries science. And even within this, kind of closer to the center, just to the inside of the WCPFC, Ben mentioned the fisheries treaty the US has with the Pacific Island countries. And there was some who may offer that treaty actually, which precedes the RFMOs in the Western and Central Pacific by about a decade or two, provided the model for the RFMO, in that it really established a lot of the monitoring and control surveillance elements for fishing vessels across those EEZs. And many of those rules were then carried up to the RFMO convention for the WCPFC for managing tuna stocks. So they're just really drilling in on the treaty. But And this is, again, going back to that, this concept of, having to have protected areas, managing a resource. So hopefully most folks are somewhat familiar with the Pacific Islands region. So our office here, you can see the Hawaiian Islands, we're on Oahu. The good chunk of the Hawaiian Islands are actually protected areas. So the whole Northwest, Papahanaumokuakea, is a national monument. And then you can also see a number of other areas within the US EEZ. So all those orange with the black hash are all also domestic protected areas, but when they are domestically protected, that also precludes international activity of any sort. You then see the US does have small protected areas within its EEZs of Palmyra and Kingman, Howland and Baker, and even within the US EEZs surrounding American Samoa, there are protected areas. And then parts of the east, you have the Marianas and Guam. There are other countries with these protected areas. So protected areas are where there's very limited exploitation or constraints on resource exploitation. So you'll see between American Samoa and the Howland and Baker Islands, there's a small EEZ for Kiribati, the Phoenix Islands. Kiribati actually has 3 disconnected EEZs, and that middle one is currently protected, but is in the process of being, I don't want to say unprotected, but the legislation is moving through Kiribati to open up that entire EEZ to fishing. So that's, I would argue, probably one of the hottest issues in the region. And what happens within the RFMO structure, we do the spectrum of management that one might expect with fisheries, catch limits, ensuring that there's uniform rule sets and implementation for bycatch, right? Encircling whale sharks or catching turtles and dolphins. But the RFMOs also provide for monitoring, control, and surveillance. And so, how you translate this, to say the outer space environment, this is ensuring flag states execute their responsibilities and duties under the fish stocks agreement. And then these, also stem from the law of the sea. So this is, having your VMS running, reporting to coastal states when you're entering and exiting EEZs, or ensuring enforcement of the provisions of the convention. And in fact, I've been spending this past week, as soon as we finish this call, I'll be running downtown to join my colleagues for a meeting called the Technical and Compliance Committee meeting of the WCPFC, where all the members, China, US, all the island countries, we sit in a room. We're doing it virtually, but the US is co-locating. And we literally run through every provision under the convention and its management measures, and we assess each other's compliance with those provisions. And then we provide a scorecard. The NGOs are able to, help apply pressure or offer areas for improvement, kind of in a think tank style, exercise that many members just don't have time for, on how to improve performance of flag states and members of the commission in managing the fish stock. And many of these provisions are drawn from the science. So we have a whole science committee made up of the members and their scientists who do provide advice to managers such as myself. And then in December, we'll have the annual meeting where we'll take that scorecard, we'll align it with the stock assessments, as well as various performance indicators with regards to monitoring and surveillance, and bring all this together to really ask ourselves, do we need to change the rules for next year? And so we go through this process every year, making slight tweaks or potentially big changes to the regime in this effort to jointly manage tuna, in this case, tuna and billfish are the big migratory species. And maybe I'll just offer that the RFMO structure, even though it's within sort of this UN framework, it moves fairly slow. And at least in the Pacific region, where we have diversity of members, that can be painful. But this is part of the burden of having a consensus-based organization, and the strength and integrity of the organization is derived from that consensus-based nature. So I don't know what the ideas or thoughts are for this sort of multilateral cooperation in outer space, but at least within the pelagic and marine environment, this is the approach that's taken. It's the framework we have, and Claire is working on introducing some new elements to it in the coming years that will certainly affect how our commission operates and how the treaty operates as well. So, we've far from figured it out, and maybe at some point in the future, the ocean conservationists and fisheries managers can learn from the experience of the space folks. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Let's see. Can you just stop screen sharing? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Claire and Alex. I'm going to just kick off our Q&A by quoting what Dr. Fiesler had in her recent Slate article. I thought a really, a great line that could get us connecting the oceans and space diplomacy parallels was this. Quote, when we let go of our techno-idealism about space, as well as our bias towards narratives built up by global superpowers, we open ourselves to the pragmatism of really working together. There's ocean decline, but there's also climate change, global health, and human rights. Space exploration may be a part of solving those problems. This really, okay, so that was what Dr. Fiesler wrote, and I totally agree with it. And I think that what we've heard so far are kind of two approaches. First, the maybe government and federal regulations of various countries coming together and working out norms in the ocean environment. And then the other being scientists that are operating within the science domain and bringing that norm-setting structure and ability to work together from a purely science collaboration sort of environment. It struck me the quote that Claire you included in the article from an Iraqi colleague who said, "Post-conflict, the Persian Gulf may never be post-conflict." But nevertheless, the amount of science diplomacy through ocean diplomacy dialogues that you've had has shown that you can still bridge that gap and have that diplomatic approach going on. So the question to both of you is, how do we bridge this gap? I'd love to get in later in this conversation with what are some of the more legal and regulatory parallels between what I would believe is a much more built out over time structure with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but also just general maritime norms, and how we're trying to talk about in this series the safe and sustainable use of outer space through anticipatory diplomacy. So just maybe Claire and then Alex, your thoughts on this. You're on mute, Claire.
Well, one thing I want to bring up right now is, so right now we have the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, right? And it's my understanding that it does not have the means built into it for effective collaborative action by states, nor does it have a scientific and technical body. But there is a new ocean treaty in the works. There was hope that it would be signed and completed this summer, but we kind of ran out of time. But there's still hope for that. It's called the BBNJ agreement, which is the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And it's my understanding that it will include these elements of a scientific and technical body, as well as an implementation and compliance committee. And I think that alone has great promise. And they've been working on this for 5 years, right? To facilitate better ocean management that engages scientists better. The Arctic agreement between states that has like an Arctic Science Council tried to do this, but I don't believe they've done it very well, of essentially bringing the scientists together with the diplomats. But I think the great thing about this, the BBNJ agreement, is that it's basically trying to kind of close those loopholes that existed when the Law of the Sea agreement was drafted. And I think at this point we have to, because a lot of these agreements were somewhat of like, built during the age of like nuclear proliferation. This is where Ambassador Pearson can help us with this. And less of a focus on, scientific engagement, implementation, and compliance. But I think, as we all know, these issues become more complex climate change, illegal fishing, ocean acidification, that we really need that engagement in there for these treaties to be effective. So I think that's a start, and that's something I mentioned in the article. That's why I have hope for that, and that's why the oceans is a great example. So I'll pass the baton to Alex.
Thanks, Claire. And hopefully I'm not getting sidetracked here, but just emphasizing the importance of that BBNJ agreement that you just highlighted, and the structure that appears to be emerging there appears to be lessons learned from the RFMO space. So all these RFMOs do have these technical committees, these science committees, and it's the best available science that informs the decision making alongside with the evaluation of compliance. And without bringing those together and then having some teeth, obligations for signatories to implement these arrangements, it really does remain the Wild West. And this Wild West environment really is, frankly, for the Pacific, what existed before the RFMO was in place. And you often had these small developing countries pitted against each other, attempting to gain revenue from their tuna resource. Whereas now you see they've been able to work collectively, both through their own organization, but also through the RFMO, to maximize not just that economic benefit, but also the conservation and sustainable exploitation of that resource. And so, translating that then to the high seas. And so often you do see some I want to say adversarial perspectives on fishing in the international space versus fishing within the zones, right? Every day you're exploiting a resource on the high seas. It's not money that's being spent, paying for access to those members. These are important issues that exist here just in the Pacific, but should somebody assert claim to something, that's going to have to be considered more broadly, and that's where the diplomacy of these multilateral entities really becomes important. Is walking people away from the precipice of that asserted ownership, and then into a joint management regime. So I'll stop there.
Great. I want to turn next to Ambassador Pearson for our next question and comment.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thank you, Claire, and thank you, Alex, very much for really interesting presentations. I too was wondering just how these two orbits are going to intersect, and beginning to see it more clearly now. So it's terrific. But let me take this into outer space. So imagine that we have a new definition for resources on Earth, which now includes bio and biodiversity, and it also, through things like the East-West Center in Hawaii, includes cultural and other enriched aspects of human experience, which are for the common good and may be shared, even though they may have a national identification. So if you take the idea that some resources are movable and some are fixed, an obvious simple division, then let me give you an example from the Eastern Mediterranean that in terms of management of the sea is a very complicated problem because there are intersecting and conflicting claims to the resources on the seafloor. And one of the most difficult issues we have is how to manage the economic zone issues that overlap. And one of the recent ideas of the United States has been to form groups of companies for geographic spaces that satisfy the national ambitions of the countries demanding access to those resources. So I'm wondering if, as seems to be the case in RFMOs, a sharing of the asset control and some sense of therefore solving a sovereign interest is also possible in space. Right now, we have a clear definition of capturing a resource for your national purpose and having complete control of it. And there is no other model presently in place. But what if instead, and we remember back in the 15th and 16th centuries what unrestrained competition for resources led to in the global picture. Imagine that we tried to create a model using the ocean examples for sharing a resource based on national equities and national investment so that no one nation controls or has a monopoly on resources. That, as usual, is a real reason for conflict. So I'm wondering what you think about the possibility of taking the both the pelagic, the movable resource, and the fixed resource, and finding a slightly different model for it that we could use in the oceans and therefore use in outer space as we expand the competition for resources on the moon and eventually on Mars. So thank you very much.
And let's go Claire and then Alex.
I don't know to what extent my expertise can answer that question. But I guess I'm left thinking about, I'm engaging a lot with developing countries. And like I mentioned in my article, these countries barely have the scientific infrastructure to do marine science, let alone space exploration. So how can we build in equity into agreements, collaboration on space exploration? So actually, Law of the Sea tried to build in equity for deep sea mining when it was drafted in the 70s. There's great investigative reporting done by the New York Times recently that showed that is not working. And there's this one company from Canada, basically, that will likely exploit most of the deep sea mining in the high seas if they're allowed to. But the BBNJ treaty is one of the reasons why it was held up and took so long and they ran out of time is because this issue of equity to both genetic marine resources and just making sure that these countries can get a leg up with scientific infrastructure and so forth. And so that's not something I'm hearing discussed much kind of with these, in space diplomacy, these Artemis Accords. How can we help these smaller countries really effectively get a leg up? But it's something that the ocean space is doing. So that's just on my mind as I work with developing countries. And how can we build in equity into these agreements going forward?
Great, Alex.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there are two things that came to mind. One, the space convention area, the literally the spatial extent of the resource that might be in question in space is really only available to a limited number of potential participants in that convention or agreement. And kind of to Claire's point, how do you extend that equity to members who may not have that opportunity? On the other hand, that same space is certainly in Hawaiian culture, but all through Polynesia, Melanesia, Micronesia, the stars and celestial entities were exceedingly important to the people. And, so does actually exploiting, say, something on Mars, which is, a key point in the sky for many people, does that cross a red line for cultures here on Earth? And how can scientists and diplomats take that into consideration when looking at the resource that only a very small number are going to potentially be able to benefit from? And then the other part of that was, and again, I apologize for not being as familiar with exploitation of space resources, but are these the sort of things like tuna is a tangible resource that's brought home, and in many cases it's a food security issue. So there's a hard argument that it's a necessity. And that makes those negotiations very different. Like, are these space resources a necessity? And is it something tangible that's brought home? Or is it a resource that really just enables a sustainable space exploration? Whether it's the harvesting of a gas or a mineral that really just stays in space, is only used by those entities rather than by the common good of the people here. Or because there really isn't at least I haven't been convinced of like a common space exploration good. Again, going back to the equity elements, the beneficiaries are not as clear cut in the space environment as they are in the ocean environment, where really, whether you're a Mediterranean neighbor and you're kind of talking about, that smaller scale shared management area, or you're a country that just benefits from canned tuna, so the entire Pacific does matter to you. And so those are the two things that crossed my mind when both Claire and the ambassador were speaking.
Well, thanks to you both. And I'll just say she couldn't be here today, but Dr. Britt Lundgren is an expert in the area of basically space exploitation as basically making sure that any sort of exploitation of space does not interfere with the cultural heritage of peoples around the world. And so that obviously has direct parallels with oceans. But something we've talked about things as simple as light pollution, that we might think of that are much more important to cultural heritage than might immediately meet the eye. So something we need to keep in mind for our cultural diplomacy going forward in space, which obviously has a lot of parallels to the oceans. Next question comes from the Q&A. Duke's own Jonathan Wiener asks, thanks for these presentations, both of which noted the use of regional networks in zones to manage oceans and fisheries. How might these regional approaches be applied in space? For example, what lessons could we learn from the idea of zoning areas on the moon or Mars for different uses? And so over to you both, Claire and then Alex.
So zoning is really effective. It's what we do on land. We zone, areas on land, commercial, residential, conservation, recreation. Marine spatial planning, which is essentially the zoning of the ocean, has been effective in other places. Never really caught on here in the United States. But there's a lot of science that shows, especially by Duke experts, that zoning for different uses is really important, right? Because that's the only way to avoid conflict, right? And so I don't know how that's going to, play out for the moon or for Mars, but a great example is looking at, Antarctic. I mean, the Antarctic Treaty, we zoned certain places of Antarctica, and not necessarily for commercial use, but for, the peaceful scientific investigation. And so Antarctica, something we haven't brought up is, Antarctic, which encompasses large parts of the ocean. Is a great example of that. I don't know. I'd love to hear if that's been talked about right now, like zoning parts of the moon and Mars. But the thing that's interesting about space and the ocean is that like space, aerial space is a resource in and of itself, whether it's a satellite or it's used for a satellite or used for like an oil platform. Just the space itself, not outer space, but the space itself is a resource in and of itself. And so I think it could be very effective. I just don't know who's been talking about it.
Excellent. Alex?
Yeah, pretty short response or thoughts. I think Ben, and I apologize for others for whom I'm not aware, you and I are both beneficiaries of the Antarctic Treaty in having conducted scientific research there, and the space that affords, really it reduces a lot of the bureaucratic burden, but then also the collective benefit is increased under a structure such as, the treaty for Antarctica. And so, just personally seeing how, to Claire's point, the slicing and dicing of space can lead to tensions and then, potentially prolong the opportunity or delay the opportunity, prolong the discussion for appropriate management when those slicing and dicing equities exist. Really, something along the Antarctic Treaty that you and I both benefited from, and that many other scientists have benefited from. Just from my perspective, operating in these slice and dice RFMO spaces, that seems like a much more preferable environment for at least having those discussions, structuring the management regime. But again, that's just my initial take. Thanks.
So I'm going to do a rapid follow-up to this. So Claire, Alex, you both brought up the Antarctic Treaty System. We're talking about the UN Law of the Sea. We've brought up the Outer Space Treaty. These all have a commonality, and that is they are treaties of the commons. And I think the one difference between the UN Law of the Sea and the Antarctic Treaty System / Outer Space Treaty is that the Antarctic Treaty System, which Claire, as you said, is effectively also an oceans treaty system, because it's, as I understand, everything below 60 degrees south, something like that, and latitude. So the question is, both the Antarctic Treaty System and the Outer Space Treaty have a lot of corollaries for peaceful scientific use of regions. The UN Law of the Sea has this as well for the regions you're talking about, for marine protected areas and things like this, but it also has a significant commercial and military and sovereign aspect of it that maybe aren't as built out, especially in outer space. And that's why, as we're seeing this booming space renaissance of the 2020s take place, with more and more countries, entities, private sector entities, large and small, getting involved in the access to low Earth orbit and beyond. And obviously, we've seen and talked about in this series even small satellite companies that are actively involved in commercially available satellite imagery that has been aiding both the understanding and delivery of humanitarian aid to places in combat zones, like in Ukraine and things like this. So the question is, with the UN Treaty of the Law of the Sea, is there, are these sort of agreements, are they direct corollaries? Can we basically skip ahead with space diplomacy to just say, okay, we have the ocean diplomacy constructs through these mechanisms. Can we just kind of stamp them over to space and get equity and more stakeholders that way? Or do we have to build a new structure because it is a different domain? Very open-ended question.
I'm happy to jump in and give Claire an extra second, because I know I think she was forced to to answer rapid fire. So I'd say, Ben, in the introduction you made for me, you highlighted some real nuts and bolts, like implementation elements of the treaty, for example, that I undertake here. And I think a really important part of trying to make that leap is understanding implementation by whoever's going to sign on to these agreements, and actually being to implement the agreement when it's made. And for each of those signatories to literally look within their, to have the capacity to look within their bureaucracy and figure out, if these low orbit satellites are being launched and then fall out, is that NASA, is it FAA, is it National Transportation Safety Board? Like literally who's going to be implementing these sorts of regs and rules that then the diplomats are agreeing to. So in the fish space, I want to say it's fairly straightforward. It's NOAA fisheries for the United States, it's the various fisheries entities around the world. So like that sort of like bureaucratic burden of being able to make the agreement and implement, right? I feel like we were talking a lot about these agreements, but the other half of it, and perhaps even the more important element, is being able to actually implement them responsibly. And just ensuring that all the signatories understand what they're coming into in that translation. So at least directly translating government responsibility and being able to implement these agreements, I don't think it's a direct translation. I think there does need to be some deeper thought domestically within the US and other partners as to how and what agencies, and then getting those agencies to talk to each other. So I talk to my counterparts at the fisheries agencies, and we literally do compare implementation of the agreement at the domestic level to make sure that, and our enforcement agencies talk to each other, our law enforcement agencies talk to each other. So anyways, and we offer trainings to try to level set investigations and these sorts of things. So there's even a lot of implementation side that isn't going to translate well from my experience in the RFMO space. Just given, again, kind of like the, this is a relatively new frontier. Sorry to use the, use the cliche, but in that sense, the bureaucracies may not be prepared for that direct, just cut and paste.
I guess my answer to this question is we had a 20th century ocean treaty, and that didn't really work for the 21st century. And now we're building a new one that builds in conservation better, science better, and scientific collaboration and compliance better. I think the same could be said for outer space. We had a 20th century outer space treaty. It was effective for the time. when only Russia and the United States were in outer space, but now it's 21st century, and we have all sorts of actors in space, and we could pretend that that will go away, but it won't. We could pretend war will not come to space, but I think it's highly unlikely. And so I think similar to what we're doing in the oceans, we need to rebuild a new treaty for the outer space. That's just me, for similar reasons.
Great. I tend to agree. I think that there's a lot of updating that needs to go on for this century in both domains. I want to go back to either Ambassador Pearson or Dr. Zanalda if you have any questions you'd like to ask next.
So yes, thank you, Ben. Just a quick question to Claire. Since you have been working on the new UN treaty, because the previous one was not signed by all countries, so what is the expectation of this one or the new one to be signed by all countries?
Including the US.
Including the US, yes.
Yes, the United States never signed the law.
Right.
A lot of that was political during the Bush II era, I believe. Yeah, I don't know really how to answer that question. I think more countries are interested in signing the BBNJ treaty just because of the urgency of the exploitation of resources and human rights that are happening in the high seas. So I feel like there's more of an urgency that all countries who are coastal countries need to sign on. So I think that's positive. I'm not particularly working on that. I have been following it. I've been engaging with the scientists and asking questions about what's going on and trying to understand how it's going to impact the region in which I work. Hopefully, once the agreement is signed, there'll be a broader engagement, but that will include scientists like myself. But at this time, I'm simply following along as the other scholars are to understand. So when it is signed, how scientists like myself and then my scientist collaborators in developing countries can best engage in the forum.
Great. Thank you. So just a moment, there is a quick follow-up from Jonathan Wiener. Ben, would you like to follow up on
Sure,
that?
yeah, this is just a follow-up. The idea of zoning, Jonathan says, the idea of zoning on the moon and Mars was raised at least at the Planetary Protection IRB report to NASA in October 2019, so very recently, and discussed at the National Academies of Sciences assessment of that PPIRB report in October 2020, and the National Academies report on the bioburden requirements for Mars missions in October 2021. So it sounds like this is extremely relevant and active right now. So thank you so much for that, Jonathan. Ambassador Pearson, over to you. See you have a question.
Sorry, just one quick observation, and that is that it's true the U.S. doesn't belong to the Law of the Sea Convention, but it uses all of those principles in its interest to try to help the international system work well. And I think the fact that the U.S. is party to 9 regional fisheries agreements is one example of how effectively the diplomats are using the treaty to try to help organize global order on this. And I think that given the conservative elements in the Senate, it would be very difficult to ratify a treaty anytime soon. But it does leave open the fact that the diplomacy part of the U.S. government could easily take advantage of the principles that are established to try to make them international norms that are widely accepted. So that's my final comment.
And the scientific community.
Yes, exactly.
As Claire pointed out, that we all believe in the relevance of having scientists in the room, precisely for this reason. So,
good point.
It's a great point. Actually, that was the next question I wanted to kick over to both of you. Claire, you're at Smithsonian Institution. Alex, you're at NOAA. You both had experience in science diplomacy in one way or another throughout your career. I've worked at the State Department, coming from an astrophysics background. One of the things that this program has focused on, even more broadly than space, if you can be more broad than the universe itself, is the the need to have, as Giovanni said, more scientists in the room. In other words, having separate from military security sort of advisement, having more scientists involved directly in the foreign policy decision-making and national security decision-making process for this country. But of course, all global democracies can benefit from this. So we've written a number of articles on the need for more scientists in the State Department and at the National Security Council of the White House. Obviously, there's a great number of scientists that are involved in science-specific areas in government, but this is more to get scientists in roles like outside of OSTP, for example. We take that as read, that OSTP should, Office of Science and Technology Policy should have scientists at it. So how much, how important is this? I think I know the answer from both of you are going to say, obviously, but I will leave it to you. But how do we get there is the question. How do we get more scientists in these roles and build out our capacity as we have in the past, building out more capacity on economic expertise and history expertise and all sorts of other non-traditional, maybe not originally traditional to international relations expertise. So over to both of you. Whoever wants to answer first, jump in.
So I can go first.
You go ahead.
So just a quick anecdote, I think, Ben, to emphasize or maybe to illustrate the point you're making. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Tarawa, Kiribati, very small atoll in the middle of the Pacific. Only 4 hours as the crow flies, or maybe albatross flies from Hawaii, but it took me over 20 hours to get there. I had to go to North America, then back down to Fiji. So remote place, but in this remote place, and we're there meeting with our counterparts, it's funny, when you're in these large multilaterals, the scientists do find each other, away from the lawyers and the creative writers. And we do actually, I want to say, rely on one another to level set the truth in that discussion. So, despite all the other elements, you do have that back channel. It's something between the track 1 and the track 2. It's like the closeted track 1.5 with the scientists meeting on the margins and just ensuring common understanding they can then bring back to their delegations of the science, that in fact, we can all agree that this is a common understanding, and then let the politics and the national interests compete at the negotiating table. So I think that's just something I lost appreciation for during the Zoom era. And so now that we're beginning to re-engage face to face, that was something that was impressed upon me. And so I'll stop there. I had another point that I forgot, and I don't want to take too much time.
Well, I have to say, I'm going to have to give some credit to some of my Indigenous colleagues. They've done a really great job of demanding to be at the table in recent years at negotiations, treaty negotiations, especially like the Convention of Biological Diversity. As scientists, I think we kind of sit around and think, one day the phone will ring and someone will invite me to be on some advisory thing for this new, international environmental agreement. And that's not how it works, And so I think scientists, it's really on scientists to push to be at the table. We don't do a very good job at that. And I really have taken heart from the way the Indigenous communities have pushed to bring their Indigenous knowledge. We should push to bring our scientific knowledge to the table, and push governments, whether the United States government or elsewhere, to make sure that we're there. But I'd love to hear Ambassador Pearson's view on this. There is, a scientist embedded engagement program. Is it what's the Jefferson Fellowship, right? That exists. I think you're muted, Ambassador Pearson.
Sorry. I endorse everything I've heard. Science and diplomacy, as we said in the very first article that we wrote, are actually real partners that have not yet learned how to talk to each other effectively. Diplomats don't take the scientific approach as seriously as they should, and they don't start as early as they should. And scientists distrust to some extent that the diplomats are going to sell their treasure away in some compromise down the road and lose the benefit of what they have found. So the core of what we're trying to do at Duke is to marry science and diplomacy together as early as possible and as far into the future as possible to address some of these issues. So today's discussion is a perfect example of what we're trying to do, and you've really helped us a lot to see how we might start drawing connections between what you've done with ocean issues and what we might be able to do with space issues, and prove, again, as I said earlier, the concept that complicated problems on a global plane can be addressed successfully if we'll just keep working at it. They all take time, but really I agree with everything I've heard.
That's a great sentiment, and I think that we here in the Space Diplomacy Lab and the Rethinking Diplomacy Program would also challenge Claire and Alex to keep proselytizing that exact message. Get scientists at the table. They have to speak up for themselves. I think it's an excellent point that you make on learning from the Indigenous community's approach to having a voice in these discussions. So that's a really inspiring way to think about this. So I want to give you both a moment to kind of give a final statement. What are some specific actions? What are thoughts on what can we do next? How do we increase the dialogue between ocean diplomacy and space diplomacy? And I will one last time quote from Claire's excellent article. At the end, she says that with or without Russia's continued participation, the lights will eventually go off aboard the International Space Station sometime around 2031, when it will fall back to Earth and splash into the ocean. I hope in that moment a symbol for science diplomacy is not the giant hunk of metal, but the ocean that caught it. And I think that was an absolutely beautiful way of describing and talking about this interplay. So with that spirit in mind, I just want to have both of you give us your thoughts for the future.
Thank you for reading that out loud. For me, it's absolutely critical that we reach an agreement for the BBNJ treaty, and that includes equity. And I think once we can do that, it sets a precedent for managing the commons of space in a way that will also include equity, and also resource use. And so I really think it's critical that we do it here on Earth before we try to do it up in outer space. It seems 10 times more complicated. So I just really, that's for me, sometimes compromises need to be made. I really hope the folks negotiating the BBNJ treaty will reach compromise so that we can get it on the table and get it enacted so that that can be a model for taking that to space.
Great.
And maybe just a slightly different a thought in closing and listening to the discussion has really been the lessons learned in the management of marine resources, fisheries here in the Pacific, and sharing or building on the theme of equity is also this idea, or maybe a subset therein, is marginalization. And whether it's a geostrategic competition that might marginalize a large key actor in the space, or economic disparity that marginalizes the less developed from the more developed. That marginalization impedes what really should be consensus-driven decision-making. And without that consensus, when you're going to raising your hand to vote, you don't have the buy-in necessary, right? You don't have the trust at the table to really not just make the agreement, but then implement the agreement and trust that everybody else is implementing it equitably for shared benefit of the common good. So I think those are lessons learned, because we do see some of the structures not falling apart, but slowing down and their effectiveness being questioned. And when you get to that stage, it may be too late. So if there's a lesson learned from the marine and fisheries area, it might be that.
Excellent sentiments to close on. And I know that we're running out of time, not only because of what it says on the clock, but because the sun has clearly come up where Alex is speaking and we're hearing bird song in the background. So I think it's time we close our latest edition of the Space Diplomacy Lab series. Again, this is part of the Duke University Center for International and Global Studies and the Rethinking Diplomacy Program. We will continue this effort to merge science and diplomacy and conversation, and continue to look at this subset of science diplomacy, which is space diplomacy, in the coming weeks and months. And as we always close out, I will say, until next time, keep looking up. Thanks so much.
And I would like to say also thank you to the Trend Foundation for supporting the lab and the Rethinking Diplomacy Program, to Rohini Thakkar and Gianluca Corinaldesi for making this possible. Thank you, and thank you to our panelists, and see you soon.
Thank you for having us.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.